Start with you. I'd like if you could talk about two things. First of all, there have been two events that have received, in the past few days, that have received a lot of exposure in America. One is the horrific killing of the teenager by Israeli youths who have been arrested, and the other was the beating up of his cousin, which has received a lot of play in the American media because it was photographed. And it seemed to me, judging by the reactions put out, the public reactions of the American Jewish organizations, that there was a real sense of shock, even in the establishment, which is so used to defending Israel. So I wonder if you could discuss that in the context of what, you know, the problems that, with the morality of Israel as some American Jews may see it, and perhaps give us some of your thoughts about where all of this is going, and do you think that, is it possible that we're headed for a schism in American Jewry between the establishment and people who become either disaffected or, you know, alienated completely from supporting Israel? Please.
Thank you. It's not pleasant to talk about divisions between American Jews and Israelis at a time when Israelis are sitting in bomb shelters in southern Israel. I don't take any pleasure in that. But I do think that we are, the divisions among American Jews and between American Jews and the policies of the Israeli government are deepening. The first reason for this division among American Jews is that we live in an age of polarization in American Jewish life more generally. If you compare American Jewish life today to American Jewish life in the middle of the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, American Jews were bunched around a growing reform and conservative movement, which was essentially the center of American Jewish life. Today, both the reform and conservative movement are declining, and what you're seeing is growth on the Orthodox right end and growth on the non-affiliated secular left end, which is to say that you have one wing of young American Jews who are growing up in an intensely nationalist environment, highly Zionistic and nationalist, and a large group of other American Jews who are growing up completely unaffiliated in an unprecedentedly secular way with very, very little Zionist attachment and indeed very, very little Jewish attachment at all. So in this era of growing polarization in American Jewish life in general, it's not surprising that you would also see more polarization on Israel. The second reason for this polarization, I think, is that what anchored the American Zionist consensus in the United States was the idea that Jews needed a state as a refuge. Zionism was very divisive in American Jewish life until the Holocaust, until it became clear that Jews facing terrible anti-Semitic persecution needed somewhere to go, and it wasn't going to be the United States. That experience of being anchored in your Zionism, because you need Israel as a refuge, makes intuitive sense even to Jews, I would say, of my age, who grew up seeing the Soviet and Ethiopian exoduses. But for younger American Jews in their 20s and 30s, they have never seen any significant number of Jews fleeing anti-Semitic persecution, anti-Semitic dictatorship at least, to Israel. So for them, Israel is what Israel does. Which is to say, if they are alienated from Israel's behavior, they are more willing, in my experience, than their parents and grandparents to ask more fundamental questions about why there should be a Jewish state at all. I say this with a lot of fear and sadness, because as a Zionist who believes very strongly in the idea of a democratic Jewish state, but I think it's quite possible that the era of Zionist consensus amongst American Jews is ending, and that we are entering an era which is more like the early part of the 20th century, where we have a growing vocal wing of American Jews who argue, especially given our own experience as a country, as people who live in separation of church and state in the United States, who argue, in fact, for some kind of different secular binational alternative. And one reason that you're seeing some movement in that direction is because the American Jewish establishment is increasingly Orthodox dominated, more and more hyper-nationalist, and can less and less speak to a Zionism of democratic struggle, a Zionism that speaks in the language of Israel's Declaration of Independence for a state that will offer complete equality of social and political rights irrespective of race, religion, and sex. Because young American Jews don't see that kind of Zionism coming from our leadership or from the leadership of Israel. They're more, I think, susceptible to a Palestinian-led one-state movement that speaks in the language of human rights and equality, I think ultimately in service of a one-state reality that would be a disaster, but which has much more appeal, I think, to a younger generation of American Jews than sometimes their elders recognize. And this is why I think that incidents like the ones we've just seen contribute to, I think, a very, very growing and dangerous polarization among American Jews, one that may make it less, that will continue unless we can find a way of calling young American Jews to a Zionism of democratic struggle, a Zionism which calls young American Jews to try to act in solidarity with those Israelis who want to preserve Israeli democracy.
Robert, one, of course, if you have any comments about what Peter said, go ahead. I'd like to ask you, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they used to say, given the religious divisions between American Jews, between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, the place where they all come together is in support for Israel. And there's even this term that Israel was the new religion of American Jews. It was the unifying code. Is it not true that it has now become the exact opposite, meaning that it has become the divisive issue? If you look at, you know, the arguments in the Hillels on the campuses, in the synagogues where some rabbis, as we know, don't mention Israel anymore because they're afraid of the strife. The J3, which we'll soon hear of at the Conference of Presidents, and even from what I hear, you know, even in people's dinner tables, the issue of Israel is not raised because if there are two people from different parts of the political spectrum, then it disrupts the evening. So is Israel now the divisive factor in American Jewry? And do you think that it won't can it not get worse if there is no peace process?
Thank you. I think the short answer to your question of is Israel the divisive factor is no. It is not the divisive factor amongst American Jewry. However, using your frame of reference, I suspect the degree of unanimous view that you suggest existed in the 60s and 70s was exaggerated. Just like the degree of divisiveness, I believe, is exaggerated in terms of its simplification today. The vast majority of Jewish Americans believe deeply in the unbreakable bond between the United States and Israel, believe deeply in the two-state solution, and especially, consistent with what Peter said, believe in a Jewish and democratic state of Israel. And what is most remarkable to me, having had the opportunity to represent what may be the district in the United States that had the largest number of Jewish voters than any other, the issue of is Israel a Jewish state never came up. Everyone, I'm using an exaggeration, but essentially everyone in the United States refers to Israel as the Jewish state. The President of the United States does so on a regular basis. The fact that it's such a controversial topic in Europe and of no controversy in the United States is a reflection, in great part, of the views of Jewish Americans, as well as the broader American political dynamic. But let me say this as well, if I may, because I think, and again, as Peter, I think, rightfully said, at a time when Israel is engaged in rocket fire and the kind of urgent dynamic that exists, I think we should refrain particularly from making generalizations that could be misinterpreted. There is no divide in terms of Israel's security, not amongst Jewish Americans, not amongst the political class in America, and those who would wish to do Israel harm should not even begin to think that there is the slightest bit of divide. However, the basis of the bond between the United States and Israel, of course, is based on shared values and shared interests. Where people, I think, make a mistake is when some Americans may question the policies of a particular Israeli government, particularly on issues of controversy, whether it be the settlement enterprise or any other issue. And then they conclude with a broad-based brush that for those Americans who may take exception with the particular policy are then jumping or leaping to a moral judgment of Israel in a way that somehow fundamentally changes the relationship. And I think that's where a leap of conclusion is made that is erroneous and can then lead one to believe that the division is much greater than it is. The division or the angst between the American government and the Israeli government didn't start with the election of President Barack Obama and the re-election and the succession of Prime Minister Netanyahu. American presidents and Israeli prime ministers have differed for decades. In fact, they have differed much more fundamentally than the current administrations in fact do, and the consequences have been far greater. Is it not remarkable that even as people describe at times the divisions between the two administrations, that there is never essentially a discussion inside the government of punitive behavior towards Israel? Because no one in government, for the most part, of consequence in the United States would support it, because they don't view the American role as being or applying punitive behavior towards Israel. So in an era in which America would never do what the previous President Bush did and threaten to withhold loan guarantees, President Obama would never do that. And yet we're talking about a division that exists as if it were new or something profound. In fact, the consensus is so great in terms of the political dynamic that people look for issues in which there are disagreements that are real. Now, I have no doubt that Peter accurately reflects a certain type of sentiment within particularly younger Americans, and that's a legitimate discussion. And Jewish Americans and Israel would be wise to address it, and address it on terms that appeal to younger Americans. To ignore it is a great mistake, but likewise a great mistake to boost this divisive element to a point where we then make rash decisions that are unwarranted.
First of all, Peter, I don't know if you've noticed, Robert has, he says, as Peter rightfully said, and then completely debunks.
That's why he's a skillful diplomat.
Jeremy, if you could react to Robert, and also speak about your feelings when you found out that the Conference of Presidents had rejected J Street and said you're not fit to join the Conference of Presidents. And I also have a quote for you, which I would like to get your, if I find it, yeah. March 1988, Yitzhak Shamir appeared before the Conference of Presidents, and he made an unequivocal statement concerning how Jews should behave. And he said, Jews abroad have a moral duty to support the government of Israel, never a foreign government against Israel. It is absolutely un-Jewish and very dangerous to join an anti-Israeli front with non-Jews. I'm assuming you don't agree with this, but we'd like to get your comment. But if you could first give us your reaction to what Robert said.
Sure, well, let me start by saying that I think that it is hard to argue that there isn't a division within the American Jewish community when it comes to Israel. I think that there's a division of opinions. I don't know that politically, in the political sphere, perhaps the way that you laid it out in the unbreakable bond and the way that Congress approaches things, that might be true. But I think within the American Jewish community, there is a shattering of consensus, and there is a very vibrant argument breaking out. That shouldn't surprise anyone. We're an argumentative people, and this is a really difficult topic. And you're having a very vibrant and wide-open argument in this country about some very difficult issues. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, I think Peter's right. There was a consensus. There was a sense of Israel as safe haven Israel as the bastion of security. It was an us versus them world. We were with us, they were them, we stood together no matter what. But it's a different world in the 21st century, and there's a very deep political divide in this country between an ultra-nationalist, ultra-religious right wing that is trying to lead this country towards one state, towards greater Israel, towards permanent occupation. And then there is you, who are trying to come together and to fight that, and to fight for the vision of an Israel that was laid out in the founding documents of this country. And it is a profound fight. And it's not just a little political spat, it is a fight about who we are as a people. Does it surprise you that that argument is being echoed in the other large Jewish community that exists in the world? There are 6 million Jews in America. There are roughly 6 million Jews here. We are now, I believe, engaging in the exact same discussion. We have a portion of the American Jewish community, as Peter said, that has moved to the right politically. It is moving to the right religiously. It remains a minority of the American Jewish community, but it has devoted greater percentages of its resources. It raises its voice more loudly, and perhaps here you are more familiar with some of their names and faces, and Sheldon Adelson is only the most visible and wealthiest of those folks. But within the other part of the United States, Jewish community is a liberal, progressive, relatively secular, at least reform and conservative, non-Orthodox community that identifies its Jewishness through the values on which it was raised. And it wants to work with you around the future of the Jewish people. And what does it mean to have a nation-state of the Jewish people? And the right wing in this country has an alliance with the right wing of the American Jewish community. They share funding and scholars, and they go back and forth, and you send ambassadors back, apparently, like a good refund policy. We get them back as ambassadors. We, on the center and center-left, need to forge a similar bond and an alliance. Because what's at stake is the future of this country, for sure, but what's also at stake is the future of the Jewish people. It's a grand heritage of thousands of years and generations that all of us share together. And how we're going to act as a people is something that, in the United States, these arguments are breaking out. I don't know that it's divisive. I think it's actually very healthy and good, but it is naturally reflective of the very difficult issues at stake. And the American Jewish community is going to participate as an active player in that debate and argument as we go forward.
Thank you. Fiamma, who told me that her name in Italian means flame, so we're looking forward. And if you could also, when you're reacting, if you could also just devote a minute or two to, in your opinion, is the situation of European Jewry so dire as it's sometimes portrayed? And also, do you think that Israel and its image are playing a role in the rise of European anti-Semitism? And the converse is whether, if there was a peace process that may alleviate the situation of European Jews.
Look, first of all, I'm sorry I'm not American, so I cannot participate in your discussion, okay? And also, it's sometimes listening to you, I have the sensation that I rang the bell to the wrong party, you know? And I'm sorry about that, but I have to say that having been in the Italian Parliament in a period when the politics of Italy that had been traditionally very close to the Palestinian and the Arab side was changing, and me, the President of the Commission of Foreign Affairs, I've been feeling very, very, very comfortably. Mostly in front of the Jewish community, either the Italian and the Council of Europe, of the European, because I've been for 5 years also a member of the Council of Europe. Actually, what I felt beyond the divisions was that the Italian and the European jury was suffering by demonization and delegitimization. I mean, criticism is logical, is part of our society. Me having being always very passionate about human rights, this is one of the basic human rights, the freedom of criticism. But, you know, and here you also come to the issue of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, the problem is not about criticizing Israel. The problem is about delegitimizing it and about demonizing it. I felt that the amount of the legitimization that fell on the Jews, I mean on the European Jews, from the sometimes mostly unjust criticism about Israel was an impossible amount to stand. I felt their sorrow, I felt their pain, I felt that when the Aftonbladet newspaper in Sweden published the news that the Israeli soldiers used to steal the organs of the Palestinians and kill them, that was something that was hard to feel, and that it had a direct relationship with the idea that continuously Israeli raising that the IDF is an army that commits crimes, that goes after the children, that is culpable of crimes that can be also be faced in the international treaty. There are many other things, like the idea that Israel, I'm sure you are aware of the fact that you must be very clever and very careful, because your criticism can end up in accusation of being an apartheid state. It can end up in accusation of ethnic cleansing. You know that in Italy, in Europe, 65% of the Poles, 48% of the Germans, 38% of the Italians think that the Israeli conduct a war of extermination against the Palestinians. Do you think that we can make ourselves responsible for this with our criticism? I mean, this criticism is absolutely legitimate. But I am sure that it has been conducted in a way, and I'm not speaking now about the United States because I'm not enough aware, but it joins with trends that are very deeply ingrained in something that we call anti-Semitism, and that we know that calling it anti-Semitism, we are also aware that it becomes a sort of Israelophobia. That's the way I call it. I suppose I have to end up this little start, but I want to say this. Europe was born on the ashes of the Second World War, just against nation states, against religions, against ethnic identity. It was born just against identity. So there is something beyond the traditional anti-Semitism, and I suppose we will go back to that because of the European elections, and I will be glad to do it. That suggests the European culture something that is not in favor of Israel because of this anti-national and anti-identity issue. It's quite clear, no? Germany and France and Italy and a country that have been at war one against the other and they speak different languages, that suddenly they try to get together. They see a little state in the middle of a sea, of an ocean of Arab states that has identity as a main point, that has its survival the survival of the Jewish people as the main point. You can figure out that this is very difficult for Europe to accept, live law. How do you say? To swallow. So on this and on many other issues that I suppose I'll have time to discuss after, there grows an anti-Semitism that I think that all of our discussions that are legitimate must be very cleverly brought on, so not to nourish the terrible sensation of the European Jews that there is something unjust against them that is coming up all over the world.
Thank you. First of all, Peter, if you could also address the question of, sometimes things that you write find their way into criticism by people who do not have Israel's best interests at heart, and I'm saying that, as an understatement. People who use you in order to attack Israel, even though you don't necessarily agree with these organizations. But also, if I can expand it, and I want to answer Robert about something. You compared President Obama to previous administrations, with President Bush. But is it not a fact that because as Peter said, the political atmosphere in America is so polarized, the attitude towards Obama is so heated, that this is also overlaps with Obama's attitude towards the peace process, what he does and what he doesn't do. And I think that many of the arguments inside the Jewish community concerning Obama also have to do, in the end, they come down to what should or shouldn't be done about Israel. So I think that has heated up the discussion. But Peter, why don't we start another?
I have no doubt that there are things that I write critically about Israel that are used by people who wish to do Israel harm and don't believe in Israel's right to exist, which I do passionately. But if I were to criticize Israel for the rest of my journalistic career, I could never say as many negative things about Israel and the Jewish people as a book called Tanakh. If there is any book that is a compendium of Jews behaving badly, it is in fact this Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which was used throughout history by our enemies, by anti-Semites, against Jews. We know from the service in Yoram Ne'im on the Chagim that in fact the Roman Emperor said to the martyrs in the Roman period, you will pay for what Tanakh says was not paid for when Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, so we will make you martyrs. We have believed as a people that it was wiser for us to be honest about our misdeeds, even if the Gentile world heard it, because it was more important to hold ourselves to a higher standard, because ultimately what mattered was what we did. Not what they said, but what we did. And that's why, although I think that much of what you say is absolutely right, there is hateful and unfair criticism of Israel, perhaps especially in Europe, and I buy the idea that Europe is in an anti-nationalist phase, which makes it hard for it to accept the idea of a nationalistic society by Israel. I don't understand when people talk about the delegitimization of Israel. It seems to me any successful conversation about how to combat the delegitimization of Israel has to start with the question of what Israel's legitimacy is based on. Israel's legitimacy is based on its democratic character. Israel's legitimacy is based on the same thing that gives any country legitimacy in today's world. It's the promise in its Declaration of Independence that even though this is a country that offers refuge for Jews, that all people will be given citizenship and right to vote and right to live under the same law. If you violate that principle and create a second Israel where only Jews have citizenship, only Jews have the right to vote, only Jews have free movement, only Jews live under civil law, that delegitimizes Israel more profoundly and it makes the work of our enemies so much easier. I don't think our big failing has been our failure to argue cleverly enough. I think that actions speak for themselves. Our failure in the American Jewish community has been to recognize that if we take pride that we are a community that were in Alabama and Mississippi when American democracy was in its moment of crucible, then we should be sending our young children to Israel today because Israeli democracy is in its moment of crucible, and we have to stand up for it. Because Israeli democracy, because as Jeremy said, our fate is deeply bound up with what happens here, because Israel is the great test of Jewish power. Israel is the test of whether a Jewish ethical tradition forged in powerlessness can survive the encounter with Jewish power, whether it can inform the actions of the Jewish state. If that experiment fails here, it fails for all of us. We cannot tell our own children that the Jewish ethical tradition is strong enough to withstand the test of Jewish power, and that will have profound implications for how we see ourselves as Jews halfway across the world.
Okay, Robert, now top that.
I would not attempt. It is clear what Peter says, from my perspective, is correct in the sense that Israel needs to remain and prosper as a Jewish and democratic state. And in order to be so, Israel needs to have a border, an internationally recognized border, which today Israel does not have. However, and this is not in response to Peter, however, to only speak to one side of this equation is not, in fact, a legitimate discussion. A legitimate discussion must include the other side of this equation. There are certain facts here that are indisputable. At least two Israeli governments, one of which represented by the gentleman who was just here before us, in fact have provided legitimate offers to conclude a two-state solution. Unfortunately, they were not accepted by the other side. Now, I'm not saying this to argue one way or the other in terms of right or wrong, but if we're going to approach a question of legitimization, which thankfully in the United States, for all intents and purposes, that is not what the debate revolves around, because there's an assumption of legitimization. And it's a place where, thankfully, a gentleman like Peter, with the intellectual courage and honesty that he possesses, can engage in a debate, and where most people will respect it and not reach improper conclusions, as some might. But the point being, and this is where I would respectfully differ with some of the conclusions, just going back to some of your initial remarks. You almost referred to the 50s, 60s, and 70s as this period of consensus among the American Jewish community. Well, in the 50s and the 60s, America didn't send any arms to Israel. It wasn't until the Nixon administration that we sent arms to Israel. So here, if you suggest that American Jewry was in this consensus opinion, it wasn't reflected necessarily in the politics of America. America's a democratic, institutional, political process. And it's improper to say, oh, that's just Congress. No, the beautiful thing about Congress, like it, love it, hate it, it in fact reflects the views of the American people. Are they influenced by different influential factors? Yes. But the fact of the matter is there is maybe no other issue other than Israel in which Republicans and Democrats still today come together in support of the security of the state of Israel. That is not a coincidence.
Jeremy, if you could address the last point. And also, I'm still waiting to hear about your feeling towards the vote of the Conference of Presidents to exclude J Street.
Well, in a way, those are related in drawing the string between what Peter and Robert are saying. The issue in the United States for the Jewish community is whether or not views such as those expressed by Peter or expressed by my organization, J Street, are accepted as within the Jewish communal tent and the pro-Israel tent or not. And the argument, I think, that might exist is, from our point of view, there are far too many instances where organizations, institutions, Jewish community centers, hillels, synagogues have to close their doors to dissenters who choose to criticize along the lines that Peter and I would, the policies of the government in Israel, for fear that their funding will be affected, for fear of what a few board members might say. And that kind of chilling effect on American Jewish debate and discussion is in and of itself fundamentally un-Jewish. In addition to the Tanakh providing good examples of our own behavior, undercutting our own legitimacy, there is also the tradition of preserving the words of both sides of the argument. That, in fact, the words of Hillel and Shammai, the houses of both, are preserved, and we recognize the value argument, the value of a good debate in the American Jewish community today, and reflected, I think, in the vote of the Conference of Presidents, is an institutional bias against a broad and open debate, and a fear of whether or not openly and honestly discussing the complex issues that face this country. And it includes you've got to acknowledge there are two sides to every fight, and there are issues that relate to Palestinian choices and behavior and the actions that are happening right now with the rockets from Gaza. I mean, one has to put those things on the table. But this debate is a complex debate. It brings into bear not only the interests, but the values of our community and of the Israeli community. And my personal feeling is that the institutions of the American Jewish community, whether it is the Conference of Presidents, or whether it is a Hillel, or whether it's a Jewish community center that doesn't want to hear a book talk from Peter, they are doing a disservice to the future of Jewry by saying that we are a people that are incapable of hearing debate and engaging in a respectful and open discussion.
I just need to ask, do you think that Jewish communal institutions should allow open supporters of BDS to appear and to speak in forums that are conducted inside JCCs, for example?
I absolutely do. I think that the best antidote for ideas that you don't like is other ideas, is to debate those with whom you disagree. If you shove them outside the door and you say that they're not allowed in, their mystique only grows, their attraction becomes a little bit that much higher. And what is the point of not having an open discussion? I will regularly debate with and appear with people who support boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. J Street opposes the global BDS movement. We fight against BDS. But I think the best way to fight is to appear and to argue. And I think we make a big mistake when we say the best way to deal with those we don't disagree with is to shut them outside the door.
Fiamma. And I'm also, since the clock is ticking away, do you think, how endangered do you think European Jewry is? Do you think that in 10 years' time, most of European Jews won't be living there anymore? Will they have come to Israel or gone somewhere else in Europe?
Look, the European Jewry is very attached to Europe. If you think that there are some that say that the real Romans are the Jewish Romans that came there in 70 after Jesus Christ. That was when they were deported there from Jerusalem, and this is where they have been living until now. Certainly there are places like France or Spain and sometimes England where life has become hard. And I go back to this. Now, you might be, and I want to say a word also about what my friends say, because I'm certainly not an expert in the Conference of Presidents, but, and I want to say also that I'm not an expert also in value of Judaism, because I think that to speak in name of the values of Judaism gadol alai, you say in Hebrew, and I don't want to do that. But as a common citizen, I go back to it. I have always been feeling very comfortable about defending the Jewish state in its democratic institutions and in its strenuous and passionate defense of democracy in the middle of a sea of violence that should push us to consider with a new sight, as Shimon Peres did today, by the way, the dimension of a peace process. So what did Shimon Peres say beyond the usual thing that he used to say? He said, for me, the most important, he said it twice, the most important thing that happened in the last weeks is that Saudi Arabia said such and such. I don't go back to that because you heard it. I think that Saudi Arabia, the Kurds, Jordania, and all the moderate, and you know, among them the Palestinians, because I'm sure that the stretched hand of Abu Mazen is very much connected also to the fact that he feels that in the middle of this Sunni craziness that we see taking fire all around us and Shiite aggression, he feels that at the end of the day, it will be hard, it will be difficult, but yes, Israel is still a safe haven for all the moderates. This is what I feel. And I am sure that Abu Mazen feels the same at the end of the day. I think that if you were out of the door, if there was a breaking situation, the Sunni ISIS and the Shiite Hezbollah would be there waiting for him with the jaws open. This is the thing that I see, that I feel. So I think that peace must be seen in another way. If there is a worry by Israel about its security, well, I think that you all will recognize that because of the many denials of the Palestinians toward the programs that were submitted to them, and because of, well, I think that having a security worry is more than legitimate, most of all after what we have seen in Gaza. I think we haven't forgotten that the Hamamoto, you know that now when I remember a word in English, the houses were left for them to continue working in there, and a lot of money was invested in them. And then they were ripped out when the synagogues were destroyed. And since, yes, I finished. Now I just tell you. Okay, I can stop here. Do we have another turn?
We'll see.
Okay.
Since we have only a little bit left, I'll let you start. I think we can't also end this without saying something about AIPAC. If one of you three gentlemen is willing to address the question on the issue of the peace process, do you think that AIPAC fills a negative role, positive role today, or doesn't fill any role? It's just an arm of the Israeli government.
Well, I just want to make 2 quick points.
So we have a minute each.
2 quick points, which I think are crucial in terms of analyzing where the American Jewish community stands today in relation to Israel. Number 1, the American Jewish community, despite the debate, is still the single most important asset in the American political dynamic that exists in advancing the two-state solution. There is a debate, but there is a consensus in support of a two-state solution. Which gets to your second point, in part, about AIPAC. I'm not going to address AIPAC versus J Street. Jeremy can do that very well. Both organizations, in my humble opinion, play an essential and important role. And they, to the degree that they compete in a marketplace of ideas, and they both attract the degree of support that they will. What is undeniable, and I can say as a member of Congress for decades, AIPAC has played an extremely important role in educating members of Congress in support of a robust friendship and alliance between the United States and Israel. And the advent of J Street is, in my opinion, a reflection of the strength of the American Jewish community, because it's strong enough to have a different point of view, and both organizations can prosper. Now, not everyone feels that way, and Jeremy would be far better placed to address that.
Jeremy, very quickly.
So I'll just pick up on Robert's last point. As the head of J Street, the founder of J Street, I would be the first to say that what AIPAC has achieved for Israel is nothing short of remarkable, and is something that those of us who favor peace and two states should not disdain in any way. What I will say is that I wish that the power and the clout that AIPAC does have would be thrown behind a strong and proactive push to achieve a two-state solution. The single most pro-Israel thing that an American Jew can do today is to help members of Congress and the administration understand how absolutely vital it is to the future and the survival of this country and to its security for there to be a two-state solution. And I think it is the absence of that message and the absence of that voice that created the vacuum in which J Street was founded.
Peter.
Robert is, I think, one of the heroes in the American political and Jewish establishment in pushing for a two-state solution. But I disagree. I don't think we have a two-state consensus amongst American Jews. I think it's fraudulent. I think we have the major American Jewish organizations say they support the two-state solution, but will do absolutely nothing to support it. Indeed, promote policies that hinder it. One example, AIPAC would not even come out in opposition to settlements that are illegal even under Israeli law. You cannot simultaneously, in my mind, support massive subsidies for settlements which provide no benefit to Israeli security. I'm not even talking about keeping the Israeli military. I'm talking about civilian settlement subsidies, and still legitimately claim to support the two-state solution. And that, it seems to me, is the real dividing line between those people who hold it as a higher principle to support the two-state solution and a democratic Jewish state, and people whose overriding goal is to support the Israeli government no matter what it does.
Fiamma, do you have...
All right. 30 seconds.
No, first Fiamma, 2 sentences.
Well, we must not look at the two-state solution as a messianic promise. There is history teaches us that it is much harder than we would like it to be, because, I would like it to be, very much so. But the refusal, the hate, the incitement are things that now we have ignorant now, but now I come also to the Israeli. But the Palestinians have their newspapers, the Fatah website, and everything full of this hate, and we have to go beyond it with a strong understanding of the situation, and not telling ourselves nice novels. Let me say a sentence about the killing of the Arab child, okay? I didn't say a word about that while you all say something.
But one sentence.
Yes, the sentence is this. In Italy, in May, there was a football game between Roma and Napoli. The Roman team is known for having a group of furious, crazy, racist, fascist people that are always with them. These people went around with a pistol. They waited beyond a corner for a Napolitan that was going there, a young boy by the name of Ciro, I will never forget it, and they kill him with shooting at him. Now, the Italian police...
Fiamma, we have to finish.
Yes, I finish. The Italian police has abducted him. He will be condemned to a life sentence, and this is what has to be done. to these disgusting, crazy, brutal people. But it is not that we have to beat our chest as if every one of us, because he doesn't think that he's faithful to the Jewish value, thinks that he identifies somehow with them. It doesn't work like this. You catch them and you put them in prison, and they are not.
Thank you. They're going to start shooting, so if you have one sentence.
Elections matter. President Obama was elected in his first election with a consensus of Jewish Americans over 70% and engaged vigorously in a peace process. And he was re-elected with a similar number and engaged in a vigorous peace process effort, which reflects a consensus in the Jewish American